we've been talking about goals, about motivation, about memorizing. My fifth question here is, what would you say is the most important thing to do or to have in order to be a successful language learner? Is it, having goals? Is it hard work? Is it innate talent or passion? What is it, the most important thing?
Well, first of all, I think that if you consider something pleasant, a lot of people use this word, this expression, hard work, but I've never seen it like that. I don't believe in. I do believe in hard work, but for me, it's always been a passion. It's always been a personal choice. It's something I've always chosen to learn languages. So it's never been hard work for me because I do things a little bit at a time. So I'm not forced to. I don't have to go to work in that language. So I have just a couple of months to learn it or to say something in that language. So first thing is that if you're an independent language learner, if you've decided to learn a language by yourself, it should be pleasant. So the first thing that I would say, and that makes you a successful language learner, is to do things that you like doing, and that is that figure out pretty quickly, and that's pretty important, what you like doing. They talk about, there's a lot of they constantly talk about the best method to learn a language. The best method is the method you like. So there are methods that are more effective than others because they abide by certain principles. They, in the brain-friendly way, so to say. But basically, you have to figure out what you like. So that's a very first thing. Then you have to put in the time. That means that you have to spend time with the language. What I do is that even if I spend little time every day, people say, "Oh, you don't learn, you don't spend a lot of time on that language." If you consider the picture, I spend a lot of time with that language. For example, German. When I started learning German, I spent 30 minutes a day, as I usually always do with when I start learning a language. But then, when you get to a certain level, you can spend 3-4 hours without even realizing it. For example, you go out with your friends, so it's not something which is just limited to your deliberate learning on hitting the books, but it involves every single aspect of your life. You go out with your friends, you talk, you speak German for 3-4 hours, and you haven't realized it. You realize it in the end. It's, oh, I spoke 4 hours in German. You wake up, you listen to 30 minutes to German radio. When you don't understand it, it seems like 3 hours because you get bored, but when you understand it all, and the sense of satisfaction keeps you going, and you spend a lot of time without even realizing that. So spending the time is very important. When you reach certain levels in a language, I'm talking, for example, about native speakers. Native speakers are always considered a role model. They say, how is it possible they speak so well? Well, the reason why they speak so well is that if you consider the path they have spent, 20 years, 24/7 on that language, speaking, listening, talking to their friends, etc., in school, etc., etc. So if you compare the time that independent language learners spend, 30 minutes, it's nothing compared to the amount of time that native speakers spend with the language. So you have to spend a lot of time. It's a long road, but it gets more and more pleasant as long as you go, as long as you move on. So another thing is spending time. The third thing is attitude. That means that the psychological factor in language learning, it plays a huge role in language learning, and it's often underestimated. A lot of people in pedagogy, for example, they focus on the technical aspects of language learning. They're trying to say, oh, I have this amazing technique, but then they don't work on the psychological aspect. With all my students, the very first thing that happens is they work with them on the psychological factor. They don't know it, but I have techniques to help them develop that. The attitude has to be...
Sorry, what do you mean by that? Is you make them motivated, or what exactly are you talking about by attitude?
Working psychologically means that, for example, I had some students, even if they know the language very well, they're a little bit hesitant. They don't want to make mistakes. They always try to say things that they know. Now, the thing is that in language learning, making mistakes is one of the best ways to learn a language if you are willing to accept your mistakes and to correct them. Now, there are a few ways to do this. If you have a tutor, so a native speaker who can help you, the very first thing that I do is to work on the psychological factor and say, look, try to say as many things that you cannot say. Like, for example, I pick up a topic that they've never talked about, and I say, have you ever talked about this? And they say, no. Let's talk about it. And so we start talking about it. They try to say things. When they cannot say something, there's something they've never seen, an expression, I fill in. I say, well, look, you say it this way. When they try to say something they know about, but for example, they make mistakes, I wait for 5 minutes, so I correct them after a little bit, and I gave them feedback, the so-called feedback. So working on the psychological factor means you have to try to venture into unknown ground all the time. You get feedback from a native speaker, a tutor, a friend, whatever, and then you have to see, you can print your mistakes. Well, I have a lot of different techniques for that in Skype, and then they review their mistakes. So what I think as a tutor, but also as a language learner, what you have to do is constantly venture into unknown ground. Now you say, this is obvious for some people, but it's not as obvious as it looks, because a lot of people tend to stay within their comfort zone.
Exactly.
So they try to say something they know, or if they don't know the language very well, so they're intermediate learners, they try to always use certain structures that they know. That's a reason why they get stuck, and they wonder, how can I get to a C1? I'm a B2, to use these intermediate phase. How can I make it further? And I say, in order to make it further, you have to venture into unknown ground. If you have a tutor, or if you have a native speaker, because I do believe in the human factor as well, you have to use them. They're resources that are as important as books to start with. I think the human factor is huge, especially when you speak a language rather well. So making mistakes.
The three important points for being successful are, we had attitude, and what else did you mention?
I don't remember anymore. I said attitude, time, and attitude, time. And I also wanted to add that it's extremely important to, especially at the beginning, to vary your work. This is like flexibility is also, flexibility means being flexible towards yourself, towards your mistakes, and towards the language learning techniques. It means that if you just started learning a language and you don't like, for example, a language series, well, it's time to change it. If you don't like what you're doing, because you find that what you're doing is a little bit boring, try to vary it a little bit. If you think that you are spending too much time, to try to reduce it and see the best. If you're trying to review things, try to choose a time frame that is more suitable to you. So you always constantly have to adjust things so that they suit your needs and your tastes. That's what I believe in, and that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Great. So once again, I think it relates to your attitude, right? Being willing to explore new ideas, new ways of learning, and being flexible and open to making mistakes.
Flexibility is part of attitude, so you can ascribe it to that. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, we've already taken a lot of time, so this is going to be my last question, because I don't want to make this too long, although it's extremely interesting, but I'm sure you're busy, you have your schedule here and everything.
I've never been as busy as now my whole life.
Yeah,
I'm telling you this.
I mean, you're organizing the Polyglot conference and your studies and everything.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. But the last question is in regard to something that is extremely controversial in language learning circles, and it is in regards to grammar. In your personal studies, do you focus a lot on grammar, or do you just try to inductively kind of absorb the grammar, just through a translation and reading and listening, or do you actually study, grammar rules and so forth?
Okay, so let's start by saying that let's look at kids, for example. There's always this the deep end, and I always say, well, kids learn better because they do certain things that we as adults we don't do, or adults we don't do. Now, the thing is that if you look at kids, the reason why they learn it so well, as I said before, is that they learn by listening and by getting exposed to chunks of the language. But most important of all, they learn from examples. Now, I've worked on a certain field some time ago as an engineer, which is neural networks from a mathematical point of view. What happened is that the striking thing is that these neural networks work. They try to, the people who conceive them try to see how the example of the human brain. Human brain, like these networks, learn from examples. If you give them a certain amount of examples, they start automatically developing patterns. And that's what kids do, and that's what I believe adults should do as well. If you, for example, if you don't understand a grammar rule, you can learn it by using, by seeing, for example, 5 sentences. If you have 4 examples of that, enough examples, you figure out how that grammar rule works inductively, as you said. You infer how the language is used to convey a certain message. So what I believe is, at the beginning, I used these bilingual texts because I compare messages. By comparing messages, you can infer how things are said and are transmitted and conveyed in another language. This doesn't mean that I don't like grammar. When you speak correctly and you're well spoken, it means that you've absorbed the language and you have made it yours. But this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to make massive use of grammar books. In the case of, for example, of languages that are very similar, this is very evident because you compare Spanish and Italian. 80% of the cases you just have to compare words because the structure is very, very similar. In languages like Japanese or Korean, that's very different because the structure is completely different. But even then, and that's why I believe that using a book like Asimov is very useful, is that if there's something you didn't understand, you can always make use of a few grammar notes that are progressive, then explain in a clear way with examples how you can use that grammar rule. So I don't even like the word grammar. I use to figure out the fabric, the tissue of a language. I compare messages and I figure it out. Then, of course, I cannot understand everything by myself. So there's brilliant people who wrote grammar rules, and the grammar rule has to be something you look at after you've seen some examples, because language is something extremely practical. So basically, what I do normally is that I start by using these bilingual texts in the beginner phase and even in the intermediate phase, and then once I've used a lot of using these grammar instructions or grammar explanations, I start, if I want to do it, I buy a grammar book and I take a look at it on and off. But I don't focus on grammar deliberately. I learn grammar from the language, as Catalan said.
Grammar before actually learning, having gone through that grammar on a text or something. You wouldn't, learn the grammar before and after go, through text and so forth. So you would do the opposite.
Yes. Basically what happens is that I consider, now for example, I'm using this book. Let me show you. I don't know if you see it. This is the 100 tough questions for Japan, and I use it like this. Look, these are bilingual texts, and I compare texts to infer the grammar. There's a lot of information here, a lot of information that you can actually get from these things. So this is extremely an interesting book because I'm going to Japan. So since I'm going to live there for a little bit, I I use these texts to understand a little bit the cultural aspects of a very different culture, but it's extremely interesting. So the fact that this book is so interesting, and the fact that it has a bilingual version of that, you can infer and you can learn so much instead of just focusing on grammar rules, because it's in context. And there's always recurring patterns in the language. There are some patterns that are more recurring than others, but you end up figuring out how the language works by looking at how it works in real life or in books and always find an interesting context. So I think that if you, and going back to what I was saying before, if you like doing, you have to like what you're doing. So if you're a grammar fan and you want to start by looking at grammar rules since the very beginning, well, by all means do so. But in general, I believe that our brain learns from examples. So if you want to make it enjoyable, if you don't like grammar so much, because as a general rule, I haven't met a lot of people who are huge grammar fans.
Right.
So if you can learn it in an indirect way as a consequence of exposure to interesting context, well, so much the better. It means that if you don't go that way, go, because I think it's one of the most effective ways to absorb the fabric of a language.
Well, these are some amazing tips. I really appreciate all the time and the interest you've given to my questions. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be extremely happy about all the tips and advice you've given us. Before we conclude,
thank you, Sam.
But before we conclude, when is your book coming? I know a lot of people are curious about that.
Well, it should come out in June 2013. I hope that it's gonna come out, at that time. Probably in Italian and English, and before summer, before I move to Japan,
Awesome.
Possibly. Otherwise, I'm not gonna find a lot of time.
Well, thanks again for your time, and it was extremely interesting to get to know more about you and about the way you approach language learning.
Thank you, Sam. Bye.